Hi everybody, my name is Eddie, and this is a brand new series I'm starting on this channel, except whoopsie daisies, it's not know-it-all. In fact, I've been doing this crap since I was 14 years old, and not mentally sound. And if you're wondering why the sudden move from my old channel to this new one, is because I want nothing more to do with those old videos. They are dead to me.
Oh come on Eddie, not all of those videos were that bad. You had like, maybe one good one.
Oh yeah, and this is Anime Whiteboard. She's like Cortana, except not visually appealing and is here to constantly belittle me. That's right, in this new series of ETACT, I talk to a whiteboard, which is essentially like talking to a wall. Anyway, as a good introduction as to what kind of stuff I'll be talking about on this new rebooted series, I'm going to be talking about one of the biggest and most iconic debates in all of video game history. Which is better, the SNES or the Sega Megadrive? Both of these consoles are two of the most iconic video game systems, not just from the 90s, but in all of gaming, and both of them hold a very special place in my heart. But today, I'm going to be taking a look at them without the rose-tinted glasses and review them from a third-person perspective.
Nintendo for the win, Sega sucks!
And then there are people like Anime Whiteboard who instantly make me regret this reboot. Okay, you want to play dirty? Let's play dirty. How about a little friendly bet? You and the SNES versus me and the Megadrive.
Okay then, here's my bet. If the SNES turns out to be the better of the two consoles, which it will be, then you have to review the worst game in your collection.
Deal. And if it turns out that the Megadrive is the better of the two, then I get to blow you up for no reason.
Deal. Wait, what?
It's too late, you've already agreed to it. We're going to be taking a look at both of these consoles in a few different categories. Hardware, game library, their add-ons, and the overall legacy that both of these consoles left. We'll do the SNES first, and then talk about the Megadrive for every category, and just to keep things entertaining, we'll try to throw in some jokes about butts and farts and stuff somewhere. Yeah. The Super Nintendo Entertainment System, commonly abbreviated to the SNES, was Nintendo's first 16-bit system, which allowed people to play, you guessed it, 16-bit games. This meant that not only was the SNES Nintendo's first system to overpower their predecessor, the NES, it was also able to simulate a lot of very 3D-like effects. This was thanks to one of its main selling points during its lifespan, Mode 7. Mode 7 was a graphics mode on the SNES that allowed for the distortion of background images to not only give smoother movement to said images, but also to create the simulation of a 3D environment. In my opinion though, it just made the whole world look like paper. Games that use this feature a lot include F-Zero, Pilot Wings, and Super Mario Kart, and these games are usually the worst victims of Mode 7. This wasn't the only thing the SNES had in terms of showcasing 3D graphics. There was actually something else that allowed the system to emulate 3D, but you didn't find this in the system, but rather in the cartridges. The Super FX chip was capable of showing graphics that the SNES couldn't do with its standard CPU. It allowed for 3D game worlds complete with polygons, texture mapping, and light source shading to run on the SNES's graphics. Unfortunately, this was only used and seen for a handful of games in the SNES's library, the most prominent ones being Star Fox, Yoshi's Island, and the SNES port of Doom. Up next was the color palette. This is something that every game console has, but is talked about less, but back in the 80s and 90s, the color palette was one of the biggest things about a system. If your console didn't at least have 100 colors to its name, then get the fuck out of here. The SNES's color palette was insanely massive. 32,768 colors to choose from, with 256 being showable on screen at once. To give you a rough perspective, the NES is estimated to only have somewhere between 50 to 60 colors. This is an ongoing dispute. Of course, what matters is how effectively the colors are used. So what's my opinion on them? They were used alright. For games that came out closer to the console's initial release, developers didn't stray too far from the minimum required, but later on, after 3 or so years, yeah, it's clear they knew what they were doing. Anyway, I think that's enough gargling on Nintendo's balls for a while, so let's talk about Sega's hardware. The Sega Megadrive, also known as the Genesis in North America because the Americans are stupid, was the first gaming console in the world to be more advanced than the NES. The SNES is more fondly known for being the better 16-bit console, but that doesn't mean they were the first. It was actually Sega that beat them to the mark, with the Megadrive releasing in 1989, 2 years before the conception and release of the SNES. Now how about the hardware that was used?
It sucks!
Is that a biased opinion I hear from the corner? It's no mystery that the Megadrive was less powerful than the SNES, but that didn't mean Sega was completely out of the competition. They still had a trick or two up their sleeve. Let's start with the disadvantages they have and then follow it up with the positives so we end on a good note. The color palette is very disappointing compared to the SNES. Only 512 colors available on its palette, with 61 being showable on screen at once. Not only that, but the sound chip used for the Megadrive was weaker as well. The SNES used a 16-bit sound chip that was capable of synthesizing actual sounds, which is why sometimes there were recordings of voices present in some games, like the opening narrator in Super Metroid or, and this is one hell of a rare example, Thomas the Tank Engine on SNES. The Megadrive, however, used an 8-bit FM sound chip, and while it could also synthesize actual sounds, they sounded more gritty and chopped up than the SNES. However, I believe in the philosophy that it's not the quality or power of the hardware that's important, it's how it's used. So let's do a quick comparison between the SNES and the Megadrive.
That's not fair. Super Mario World came out in 1991 and Sonic 3 came out in 1994. At least do 2 games from the same year.
Alright, fine. Yeah, 256 colors my ass. Nintendo, eat your heart out. Remember how I said that Sega still had a trick or two up their sleeve? Yeah, I want to talk about those now. Just like Nintendo and their Mode 7, Sega also had their own gimmick to use as a selling point. Sometime early on during the Megadrive's lifespan, Sega discovered that their console had a faster processor than the SNES. This led them to quickly boast the Megadrive's blast processing, which Nintendo claimed was just a meaningless selling point. Yeah, they were kinda right, but the Megadrive's processor was still faster than the SNES. Sega was very vague concerning the meaning behind blast processing, but some people think it had to do with the Megadrive's CPU clock rate. And that means the frequency at which the clock generator of a processor can generate pulses, which are used to synchronize the operations of its components and is used as an indicator of the processor's speed. So basically, higher clock rate, faster CPU, which means faster processor. So, everything's explained.
Nothing's explained. We still don't know what the hell blast processing is.
Neither did Sega, but that didn't stop them. This is where Nintendo may lose some points for this comparison. Nintendo only ever released 2 add-ons for the SNES, and one of them might not even be considered an add-on, so it might just be me being generous. Let's start off with the one that is for sure a by definition add-on, the Satellaview. The Satellaview was a satellite modem that you connected to the SNES by plugging it into the top of the actual modem. It looks like a stack of grey waffles now. Once it was plugged in, you could use it to download games, magazines, and other media using satellite broadcasts provided by a Japanese radio company known as ST Giga. Wait, is it ST Giga or is it Saint Giga? I don't know, I'm just gonna call him ST Giga. You'd pay for the satellite itself, as well as a monthly subscription provided by ST Giga and Nintendo. Unfortunately, there were quite a few problems with this add-on. 1. The Satellaview was never released outside of Japan and was only compatible with the Japanese equivalent of the SNES called the Super Famicom. 2. Most of the content that was originally available for the Satellaview has been lost to time. And 3. Nintendo stopped supporting ST Giga as well as the Satellaview less than 4 years after its release because ST Giga refused making a debt management plan and failing to secure a government broadcasting license. ST Giga would continue to supply content to the Satellaview until June of 2000 when it was eventually discontinued. However, much of the content originally thought to be lost to time has been recovered and preserved through various websites and groups online so that people of future generations can see and experience what it was that late 90s Japanese audiences were given during a time where 3D gaming was becoming the future. The Satellaview would be somewhat revived with Nintendo's next home console, the Nintendo 64, and their add-on, the 64DD, but that's a story for another time. Besides the Satellaview, there was the Super Game Boy. Rather than being an add-on that required to be connected to the system, you just popped it into the cartridge slot like you would with any game on the system, and then you could play Game Boy games on the TV. Some people would consider this to be a peripheral, but I just kinda want Nintendo to have something besides an add-on exclusive to the same country that would later give us that. You could add borders, create your own borders, pick from different color palettes, and was compatible with at least half of the Game Boy's library. But Eddie, you're probably asking, what about Game Boy Color games? Well, I'm glad you asked that totally real question that all of you watching this video physically said in unison just now. In 1998, Nintendo released a follow-up to the Super Game Boy called the Super Game Boy 2, which was compatible with Game Boy Color games and had a link cable port so you could play two-player games. But was only ever released exclusively to Japan, goddamn! Why does Japan get all the cool experimental stuff, huh? Did Nintendo not realize that if they sold the Satellaview and the Super Game Boy 2 to the Western world, that it would have made them 10 times more money than they did if it wasn't Japan exclusive? The Satellaview, maybe not so much, but everybody loved the Super Game Boy and they would have loved the Super Game Boy 2. But no, Japan gets all the cool satellite modem stuff and the rest of the world is left to rot. But Sega, though, Sega had way more add-ons than the SNES could have ever dreamed of having. The first two that would immediately come to mind are the Sega CD and the 32X. The Sega CD was the first add-on released by Sega as early as 1991. It was capable of producing full motion video as well as enhancing the graphical capabilities of the Megadrive by a wide margin, giving it a faster CPU and being capable of sprite scaling and sprite rotation. It could also play audio CDs. I don't know if that has anything to do with how the console does, but I just thought I'd let it be known. You could just play audio CDs. All of the games for the CD came on a disc, which allowed for bigger games that couldn't fit on Megadrive cartridges. There were plenty of games that showed off the graphical power of the CD at its best, including Sonic CD, a CD port of Streets of Rage that was considered far more faithful to the original than the Megadrive version, Eternal Champions, Challenge from the Dark Side, and CD-enhanced ports of Echo the Dolphin and Batman Returns. As well as the most controversial game of all time, Night Trap, which was so controversial that it led to the creation of the ESRB rating system in America, but that's a story for another day. The next add-on Sega made for the Mega Drive was the 32X. This little doodad was capable of 32-bit gaming, thereby doubling the number of pixels available on screen, and it also acted as essentially a power booster for the vanilla Mega Drive. It sucked. Well, sucked is a strong word, but it was weak in many places. The main reason that the 32X failed commercially was because of the simultaneous announcement of Sega's next console and their first attempt at a 3D console, the Sega Saturn. Couple that with a small library of 40-something games and the fact that Sega failed to secure any third-party game developers and consumers, and they were left with the beginning of the end of their console-making days. And then there was the power base converter, which you put into the cartridge slot of the Mega Drive, and bingo bango bongo, you can play almost every single game from Sega's previous console, the Master System. The only problem with this one was that it was only compatible with a specific model of the Mega Drive. And that's pretty much it for all the add-ons for the Sega Mega Drive. But there is one more thing I want to talk about.
Wait, what?
One last thing that separated Nintendo from Sega during this period.
No, wait. You said you wouldn't talk about this one.
This is a market that Sega beat Nintendo to with an insight of about 20-something years.
Eddie, come on. We can talk about this, man. You don't have to do this.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to show you something called the Sega Nomad. This chunky plastic brick has the exact same hardware as a traditional Mega Drive with a few exceptions. The biggest one being that it is a handheld console that is fully and 100% capable of playing every Mega Drive game available. And when I say every Mega Drive game, I mean it. Every single one. Over 800 official titles were playable and portable with this thing. Sure, it would look better being on a TV with an actual console you plugged into the wall socket, but think about it. You could play Sonic the Hedgehog 2 on the go whenever and wherever you wanted to. Of course though, there were problems that people had with the console, the biggest problem being with the screen. The screen was much like the Game Boy screen. It wasn't lit up, so you had to have just the right amount of brightness and next to no glare from any light sources to see anything on screen. Apparently the screen's natural motion blur was a big issue too, but I wouldn't have any idea what it's like because I'm not going to spend $500 on a secondhand video game system from the 1990s that I'm probably never going to play in my life. Okay, that's it. There were no more add-ons made for the Megadrive besides these 4. Sure, you can't really consider the Sega Nomad to be an official add-on because it's its own separate system, but I disagree because the official Oxford Dictionary defines the term add-on as being, and I quote, an accessory device designed to increase the capability of a computer or hi-fi system. Example sentence. Now you can get the incredible sound of a compact disc without getting an add-on amplifier. And with that, Nintendo can sucketh thy gonad region. Let me put it to you this way. Would you rather play a watered-down, built from the ground up handheld port of Sonic 1 for Game Gear, or would you rather play the Mega Drive version of Sonic 1 as God intended, using what's basically Sega's 20-year insight into the Nintendo Switch? Yeah, that's what I thought. It's honestly no surprise that Nintendo had the better choice when it came to games for the SNES or Mega Drive. Having a lot of games and having a lot of good games is what, without a shadow of a doubt, helped the SNES out Pizza the Hut against Sega.
No surprises there.
However, there is one problem with that, and we're going to come back to that in just a second. Whenever somebody mentions the SNES, the first few games I think of are their famous first-party games. Super Mario World, A Link to the Past, Super Metroid, Yoshi's Island, Star Fox, Pilot Wings, F-Zero, etc. But they also had great third-party games, which for anybody who doesn't know what that means, are games that weren't developed by Nintendo but still got published by them to be on their console. This is what they would call their Nintendo Seal of Quality, which basically meant, yeah, we played it and it's not a complete dumpster fire. Final Fantasy, Street Fighter, Doom, those kind of games. Sega would eventually get their own ports of some of these to be on the Mega Drive so that they would be available on both systems, but then came the debate of whether the SNES version or the Mega Drive version was better. Of course, this debate entirely came down to one thing: personal preference. If you owned an SNES, chances are you'd prefer the SNES version of a game released for both consoles and vice versa if you owned a Mega Drive. All of the SNES versions of games released for both of these systems were superior in every way, including the graphics, sound design, and gameplay, but there was one big problem. The vast majority of the SNES's library was too family friendly.
Whoa, wait a minute. Are you trying to say that Nintendo was too family friendly with the SNES?
I'm not trying to say that Nintendo was being too family friendly with the SNES. I am saying that Nintendo was being too family friendly with the SNES. And there's one specific trilogy of games that was released for both the SNES and the Mega Drive that proves my point exactly. I will openly admit that Sega's library of games for the Mega Drive was weak compared to the SNES. The SNES had somewhere around 1,700 games and the Mega Drive had just over half, but we can add more to that if we include the games from the add-ons. The Sega Mega Drive had a total library of around 900 games. With the Master System converter I mentioned earlier, you also get to play all 360 games for that console. The Sega CD had 205 games and the 32X only had 40. So add all of these numbers together and you get a grand total of 1,505 games.
Kinda sucks that you have to add all of the add-ons together to get even close to the amount the SNES had.
That's true, but the Mega Drive had some games and secrets you couldn't get on the SNES.
Oh yeah?
Remember that little trilogy I mentioned earlier?
What?
Oh yeah. You thought I'd forgotten about them, hadn't you?
You're bluffing.
Wanna bet?
No! Okay, you win!
Nope, too late.
No!
In 1992, an arcade fighting game called Mortal Kombat was released by Midway. It became so incredibly popular for its over-the-top violence that it eventually found its way to 2 handheld systems and 2 home consoles.
Yes!
The Game Boy, Nintendo's handheld at the time,
Yes!
the Game Gear, Sega's handheld at the time,
Yes!
the SNES, and
Yes!
the Mega Drive. The SNES port had more accurate graphics and audio of the original arcade version, but unfortunately had less precise controls and had replaced all of the blood with sweat due to Nintendo's family-friendly policies. However, if you owned a Game Genie for the SNES back in the day, you could revert the sweat back into blood since the sweat was just a recolor. Not only that, but Nintendo had also gotten rid of some of the bloodier fatality moves entirely. The Megadrive version, on the other hand, didn't resemble the arcade version as accurately, but it had one thing that separated it from the SNES by a wide margin: the blood code. By spelling out ABACABB, which was also the name of a Genesis album, Abacab, you unlocked all of the blood and the more gruesome and uncensored fatalities. Not only that, but the Sega CD version didn't even require a cheat code to unlock the blood and was available from the start. The only problem that came with this was that the newly established ESRB rating system gave it an MA17 rating, and as for the original Mega Drive version, that only got an MA13 rating. Maybe that was because the blood was hidden behind a code and not there from the beginning, but I don't know.
So you're saying that the Mega Drive's game library was better than the SNES's because of one game?
Let me finish. And as a matter of fact, the vast majority of the Mega Drive's games were considered the more mature alternative to Nintendo's very family-friendly library. Even Sega had their own successful first-party titles. Obviously, you have the Sonic the Hedgehog games. Every story has a Christ figure. But they also had games like Alex Kidd, Phantasy Star, even Disney's Aladdin were all considered some of the best games on the system. Not only that, but when Street Fighter 2 was going to make the leap to consoles, Capcom initially skipped over the Mega Drive.
As they should have.
But they saw how quickly the Mega Drive's popularity was getting and released a special port called Street Fighter 2 Champion Edition, which is widely considered the definitive way to play Street Fighter 2. And on top of all that, you had Virtua Fighter, Altered Beast, Shinobi, Comic Zone, Bonanza Bros, Echo the Dolphin, Streets of Rage, Kid Chameleon, and so many more iconic and arcade-style games which were the main appeal for the system.
What makes you think any of the games you just mentioned were any better than the games on the SNES? I've never seen you play most of those games, so for all I know, you could be talking out of your butt.
You do understand that I can silence you with a single wet wipe, right?
Please continue.
Thank you. Although the SNES is considered the more successful console out of these two, it hasn't necessarily left the same impact as the NES among its fanbase. This isn't me saying that it hasn't left any form of legacy, because it definitely has, but I wanted to bring up an interesting point. The SNES was Nintendo perfecting the 2D formula that was pioneered with the NES, and the same thing can be said about the Nintendo GameCube perfecting the 3D formula that was pioneered with the Nintendo 64. But that's the problem. It only perfected gaming. It didn't revolutionize it. The NES practically saved gaming and turned it into what it is now. Without the NES, I probably wouldn't be here sitting in my room talking about over 30-year-old video game systems, and probably doing something moderately more successful than that. Ice skating, probably. But looking back on history, I noticed a pattern. Have you ever noticed that whenever Nintendo needs to use an old sprite of Mario for nostalgic reasons, that they always go with the Super Mario Bros. 1 sprite rather than something like the Super Mario World sprite? Just thought it was worth mentioning at least. There is a big difference between the terms pioneered and perfected. Something that pioneered means that it was the first of its kind and could never be replicated without looking too much like the original. Something that has been perfected means that it took what the original or predecessor had and simply made it better. The NES pioneered contemporary gaming and turned it into the present, while the SNES simply perfected it. You tell me which one sounds more appealing. Would you rather watch a movie that was made in the 70s that was the first of its kind, like the original Star Wars movie, or would you rather watch a movie that follows the same formula but just looks nicer and was made more recently, like the Star Wars sequel movies? If you answered with the second choice, not only are you wrong, but you're also incredibly stupid. Because my opinion is the only correct one here, right, Anime Whiteboard?
I need an adult.
So my short answer for this category: did the SNES leave any sort of legacy behind after its release? Yes, obviously. But whether you like it or not, the SNES didn't want to be outdone by the Mega Drive, so that's why it cracked under pressure and released the system. And speaking of the Mega Drive, I do not care what anybody says about this debate. The Sega Megadrive was the world's first 16-bit system and the first 16-bit system to outpower the NES. It is not a matter of opinion, it is a matter of fact, and if you do not like that, you are more than welcome to argue with me, but it's an argument you will not win. While, yes, the Mega Drive didn't have nearly as many games as its competition had, it still had some titles to be able to call its own, like the aforementioned Sonic and uncensored Mortal Kombat games. However, if the reception of the add-ons were any indication of their future in the console market, it could only go downhill from that point onward. But I will say that the Sega Mega Drive's graphics still look very pleasing to look at, especially when you compare two games from the same year for both systems like before. Comparing the smooth, high-speed stage building of Sonic 2 with the slower and more blocky world of Super Mario World is like comparing salt to sugar. They're both great in their own ways, but only in specific situations. You wouldn't want to put sugar on an expensive T-bone steak dinner, and you wouldn't put salt in with your children's cereal bowl. You wouldn't put Mario into a smooth world with slopes, loops, and tunnels that'll rock you off into space, and you wouldn't put Sonic in a blocky world where nothing allows him to gain momentum and speed. Two things he is very well known for doing. I think that's the weirdest analogy I've ever written in my life. Simply put, both of these systems are great, but the question of which one is better is ultimately up to your opinion. You just have to look at the facts and see which one tickles your fancy more than the other. In my personal opinion, I'd go with the Sega Mega Drive. Yes, it had less games on it, and it was less powerful than the SNES, but it was the first video game system to achieve 16-bit gaming and outpower the NES. Not to mention, they were open to using more formats to put games on, like discs, something Nintendo wouldn't catch on for another 15 years after the release of the SNES. And you can't deny some of the great games that were available on this thing, like Street Fighter II Champion Edition, the uncensored Mortal Kombat games, Phantasy Star, Fatal Labyrinth, Altered Beast, Shinobi, and of course, Sega's golden boy, Sonic the Hedgehog. I'm both a Sega and Nintendo fan, so both of these consoles have their own unique sense of appeal. If you want quality, you go to Nintendo. If you want a more arcade-like experience, you'd go to Sega. Not that Sega didn't have any quality, they definitely did. But like I said, the true answer to this debate can't be decided by sheer numbers and comparisons alone. It all comes down to one thing. Which one do you prefer personally? I've given my answer, and now that you've heard me talk about these systems for an absurd amount of time, I think it's about time we finish this comparison. Well, Anime Whiteboard, we did it. After more than 4 years of quitting this show, we made a new episode, and on a completely new channel, no less.
Yeah, we actually did it. And hey, neither of us have to commit to our bet that we made at the beginning. You don't have to review the worst game in your collection, and I don't have to blow up.
Yeah, that's probably the best outcome for both of us. But I'm still gonna blow you up for no reason.
Wait, what?